There is nothing worse than feeling dependent on other people. Dependency makes you vulnerable to all kinds of emotions, betrayal, disappointment, frustration, that play havoc with your mental balance. Early in the American Civil War, General Ulysses S. Grant, eventual commander-in-chief of the Northern armies, felt his authority slipping. His subordinates would pass along inaccurate information on the terrain he was marching through. His captains would fail to follow through on his orders. His generals were criticizing his plans. Grant was stoical by nature, but his diminished control over his troops led to a diminished control over himself and drove him to drink. Grant had learned his lesson by the time of the Vicksburg campaign in 1862-63. He rode the terrain himself, studying it firsthand. He reviewed intelligence reports himself. He honed the precision of his orders, making it harder for his captains to flout them. And once he had made a decision, he would ignore his fellow generals' doubts and trust his convictions. To get things done, he came to rely on himself. His feelings of helplessness dissolved, and with them all of the attendant emotions that had ruined his presence of mind. Being self-reliant is critical. To make yourself less dependent on others and so-called experts, you need to expand your repertoire of skills, and you need to feel more confident in your own judgment. Understand, we tend to overestimate other people's abilities. After all, they're trying hard to make it look as if they knew what they were doing, and we tend to underestimate our own. You must compensate for this by trusting yourself more and others less. It is important to remember, though, that being self-reliant does not mean burdening yourself with petty details. You must be able to distinguish between small matters that are best left to others and larger issues that require your attention and care. Suffer fools gladly. John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, is one of history's most successful generals. A genius of tactics and strategy, he had tremendous presence of mind. In the early 18th century, Churchill was often the leader of an alliance of English, Dutch, and German armies against the mighty forces of France. His fellow generals were timid, indecisive, narrow-minded men. They balked at the Duke's bold plans, saw dangers everywhere, were discouraged at the slightest setback, and promoted their own country's interests at the expense of the alliance. They had no vision, no patience. They were fools. The Duke, an experienced and subtle courtier, never confronted his colleagues directly. He did not force his opinions on them. Instead, he treated them like children, indulging them in their fears while cutting them out of his plans. Occasionally, he threw them a bone, doing some minor thing they had suggested, or pretending to worry about a danger they had imagined. But he never let himself get angry or frustrated. That would have ruined his presence of mind, undermining his ability to lead the campaign. He forced himself to stay patient and cheerful. He knew how to suffer fools gladly. Understand, you cannot be everywhere or fight everyone. Your time and energy are limited, and you must learn how to preserve them. Exhaustion and frustration can ruin your presence of mind. The world is full of fools, people who cannot wait to get results, who change with the wind, who can't see past their noses. You encounter them everywhere. The indecisive boss, the rash colleague, the hysterical subordinate. When working alongside fools, do not fight them. Instead, think of them the way you think of children or pets, not important enough to affect your mental balance. Detach yourself emotionally. And while you're inwardly laughing at their foolishness, indulge them in one of their more harmless ideas. The ability to stay cheerful in the face of fools is an important skill. Crowd out feelings of panic by focusing on simple tasks. Lord Yamanouchi, an aristocrat of 18th century Japan, once asked his tea master to accompany him on a visit to Edo, later Tokyo, where he was to stay for a while. He wanted to show off to his fellow courtiers his retainer's skill in the rituals of the tea ceremony. Now, the tea master knew everything there was to know about the tea ceremony, but little else. He was a peaceful man. He dressed, however, like a samurai, as his high position required. One day, as the tea master was walking in the big city, he was accosted by a samurai who challenged him to a duel. The tea master was not a swordsman and tried to explain this to the samurai, but the man refused to listen. To turn the challenge down would disgrace both the tea master's family and Lord Yamanouchi. He had to accept, though that meant certain death. And accept he did, requesting only that the duel be put off to the next day. His wish was granted. In panic, the tea master hurried to the nearest fencing school. If he were to die, he wanted to learn how to die honorably. To see the fencing master ordinarily required letters of introduction, but the tea master was so insistent, and so clearly terrified, that at last he was given an interview. The fencing master listened to his story. The swordsman was sympathetic. He would teach the poor visitor the art of dying, but first, he wanted to be served some tea. The tea master proceeded to perform the ritual, his manner calm, his concentration perfect. Finally, the fencing master yelled out in excitement, "No need for you to learn the art of death. The state of mind you're in now is enough for you to face any samurai. When you see your challenger, imagine you're about to serve tea to a guest. Take off your coat, fold it up carefully, and lay your fan on it just as you do at work." This ritual completed, the tea master was to raise his sword in the same alert spirit. Then he would be ready to die. The tea master agreed to do as his teacher said. The next day he went to meet the samurai, who could not help but notice the completely calm and dignified expression on his opponent's face as he took off his coat. Perhaps, the samurai thought, this fumbling tea master is actually a skilled swordsman. He bowed, begged pardon for his behavior the day before, and hurried away. When circumstances scare us, our imagination tends to take over, filling our minds with endless anxieties. You need to gain control of your imagination, something easier said than done. Often, the best way to calm down and give yourself such control is to force the mind to concentrate on something relatively simple. A calming ritual, a repetitive task that you are good at. You are creating the kind of composure you naturally have when your mind is absorbed in a problem. A focused mind has no room for anxiety or for the effects of an overactive imagination. Once you have regained your mental balance, you can then face the problem at hand. At the first sign of any kind of fear, practice this technique until it becomes a habit. Being able to control your imagination at intense moments is a crucial skill. Unintimidate yourself. Intimidation will always threaten your presence of mind, and it is a hard feeling to combat. During World War II, the composer Dmitri Shostakovich and several of his colleagues were called into a meeting with the Russian ruler Joseph Stalin, who had commissioned them to write a new national anthem. Meetings with Stalin were terrifying. One misstep could lead you into a very dark alley. He would stare you down until you felt your throat tighten. And, as meetings with Stalin often did, this one took a bad turn. The ruler began to criticize one of the composers for his poor arrangement of his anthem. Scared silly, the man admitted he had used an arranger who had done a bad job. Here he was digging several graves. Clearly, the poor arranger could be called to task. The composer was responsible for the hire, and he too could pay for the mistake. And what of the other composers, including Shostakovich? Stalin could be relentless once he smelled fear. Shostakovich had heard enough. It was foolish, he said, to blame the arranger, who was mostly following orders. He then subtly redirected the conversation to a different subject: whether a composer should do his own orchestrations. What did Stalin think on the matter? Always eager to prove his expertise, Stalin swallowed the bait. The dangerous moment passed. Shostakovich maintained his presence of mind in several ways. First, instead of letting Stalin intimidate him, he forced himself to see the man as he was: short, fat, ugly, unimaginative. The dictator's famous piercing gaze was just a trick, a sign of his own insecurity. Second, Shostakovich faced up to Stalin, talking to him normally and straightforwardly. By his actions and tone of voice, the composer showed that he was not intimidated. Stalin fed off fear. If, without being aggressive or brazen, you showed no fear, he would generally leave you alone. The key to staying unintimidated is to convince yourself that the person you're facing is a mere mortal, no different than you, which is in fact the truth. See the person, not the myth. Imagine him or her as a child, as someone riddled with insecurities. Cutting the other person down to size will help you to keep your mental balance. Develop your Fingerspitzengefühl, fingertip feel. Presence of mind depends not only on your mind's ability to come to your aid in difficult situations, but also on the speed with which this happens. Waiting until the next day to think of the right action to take does you no good at all. Speed here means responding to circumstances with rapidity and making lightning-quick decisions. This power is often read as a kind of intuition, what the Germans call Fingerspitzengefühl, fingertip feel. Erwin Rommel, who led the German tank campaign in North Africa during World War II, had great fingertip feel. He could sense when the Allies would attack and from what direction. In choosing a line of advance, he had an uncanny feel for his enemy's weakness. At the start of a battle, he could intuit his enemy's strategy before it unfolded. To Rommel's men, their general seemed to have a genius for war, and he did possess a quicker mind than most. But Rommel also did things to enhance his quickness, things that reinforced his feel for battle. First, he devoured information about the enemy, from details about its weaponry to the psychological traits of the opposing generals. Second, he made himself an expert in tank technology so that he could get the most out of his equipment. Third, he not only memorized maps of the North African desert, but would fly over it at great risk to get a bird's-eye view of the battlefield. Finally, he personalized his relationship with his men. He always had a sense of their morale and knew exactly what he could expect from them. Rommel didn't just study his men, his tanks, the terrain, and the enemy. He got inside their skin, understood the spirit that animated them, what made them tick. Having felt his way into these things, in battle, he entered a state of mind in which he did not have to think consciously of the situation. The totality of what was going on was in his blood, at his fingertips. He had Fingerspitzengefühl. Whether or not you have the mind of a Rommel, there are things you can do to help you respond faster and bring out that intuitive feel that all animals possess. Deep knowledge of the terrain will let you process information faster than your enemy, a tremendous advantage. Getting a feel for the spirit of men and material, thinking your way into them instead of looking at them from outside, will help to put you in a different frame of mind, less conscious and forced, more unconscious and intuitive. Get your mind into the habit of making lightning-quick decisions, trusting your fingertip feel. Your mind will advance in a kind of mental blitzkrieg, moving past your opponents before they realize what has hit them. Finally, do not think of presence of mind as a quality useful only in periods of adversity, something to switch on and off as you need it. Cultivate it as an everyday condition. Confidence, fearlessness, and self-reliance are as crucial in times of peace as in times of war. Franklin Delano Roosevelt showed his tremendous mental toughness and grace under pressure not only during the crises of the Depression and World War II, but in everyday situations, in his dealings with his family, his cabinet, his own polio-racked body. The better you get at the game of war, the more your warrior frame of mind will do for you in daily life. When a crisis does come, your mind will already be calm and prepared. Once presence of mind becomes a habit, it will never abandon you. Reversal. It is never good to lose your presence of mind, but you can use those moments when it is under threat to know how to act in the future. You must find a way to put yourself in the thick of battle, then watch yourself in action. Look for your own weaknesses and think about how to compensate for them. People who have never lost their presence of mind are actually in danger. Someday they will be taken by surprise, and the fall will be harsh. All great generals, from Julius Caesar to Patton, have at some point lost their nerve, and then have been the stronger for winning it back. The more you have lost your balance, the more you will know about how to right yourself. You do not want to lose your presence of mind in key situations, but it is a wise course to find a way to make your enemies lose theirs. Take what throws you off balance and impose it on them. Make them act before they are ready. Surprise them. Nothing is more unsettling than the unexpected need to act. Find their weakness, what makes them emotional, and give them a double dose of it. The more emotional you can make them, the farther you will push them off course. Here are further reflections on the strategy of counterbalance. From On War, by Karl von Clausewitz. Presence of mind must play a great role in war, the domain of the unexpected, since it is nothing but an increased capacity of dealing with the unexpected. We admire presence of mind in an apt repartee, as we admire quick thinking in the face of danger. The expression presence of mind precisely conveys the speed and immediacy of the help provided by the intellect. By Thomas Hardy. More life may trickle out of men through thought than through a gaping wound. From Military History of Ulysses S. Grant, by Adam Badeau. So Grant was alone. His most trusted subordinates besought him to change his plans, while his superiors were astounded at his temerity and strove to interfere. Soldiers of reputation and civilians in high places condemned in advance a campaign that seemed to them as hopeless as it was unprecedented. If he failed, the country would concur with the government and the generals. Grant knew all this and appreciated his danger, but was as invulnerable to the apprehensions of ambition as to the entreaties of friendship, or the anxieties even of patriotism. That quiet confidence in himself, which never forsook him, and which amounted indeed almost to a feeling of fate, was uninterrupted. Having once determined in a matter that required irreversible decision, he never reversed, not even misgave, but was steadily loyal to himself and his plans. This absolute and implicit faith was, however, as far as possible from conceit or enthusiasm. It was simply a consciousness or conviction, rather, which brought the very strength it believed in, which was itself strength, and which inspired others with the trust in him, because he was able thus to trust himself. From Legends of the Samurai, by Hiroaki Sato. There was once a man who may be called the generalissimo of robbers, and who went by the name of Hakamadare. He had a strong mind and a powerful build. He was swift of foot, quick with his hands, wise in thinking and plotting. Altogether, there was no one who could compare with him. His business was to rob people of their possessions when they were off guard. Once, around the 10th month of a year, he needed clothing and decided to get hold of some. He went to prospective spots and walked about, looking. About midnight, when people had gone to sleep and were quiet, under a somewhat blurry moon, he saw a man dressed in abundant clothes sauntering about on a boulevard. The man, with his trouser skirt tucked up with strings, perhaps, and in a formal hunting robe which gently covered his body, was playing the flute, alone, apparently in no hurry to go to any particular place. "Wow, here's a fellow who's shown up just to give me his clothes," Hakamadare thought. Normally, he would have gleefully run up and beaten his quarry down and robbed him of his clothes. But this time, unaccountably, he felt something fearsome about the man, so he followed him for a couple of 100 yards. The man himself didn't seem to think, "Somebody's following me." On the contrary, he continued to play the flute with what appeared to be greater calm. "Give him a try," Hakamadara said to himself, and ran up close to the man, making as much clatter as he could with his feet. The man, however, looked not the least disturbed. He simply turned to look, still playing the flute. It wasn't possible to jump on him. Hakamadara ran off. Hakamadara tried similar approaches a number of times, but the man remained utterly unperturbed. Hakamadara realized he was dealing with an unusual fellow. When they had covered about 1,000 yards, though, Hakamadara decided he couldn't continue like this, drew his sword, and ran up to him. This time the man stopped playing the flute and, turning, said, "What in the world are you doing?" Hakamadara couldn't have been struck with greater fear even if a demon or a god had run up to attack him when he was walking alone. For some unaccountable reason, he lost both heart and courage. Overcome with deathly fear, and despite himself, he fell on his knees and hands. "What are you doing?" the man repeated. Hakamadara felt he couldn't escape even if he tried. "I'm trying to rob you," he blurted out. "My name is Hakamadara." "I've heard there's a man about with that name, yes. A dangerous, unusual fellow, I'm told," the man said. Then he simply said to Hakamadara, "Come with me," and continued on his way, playing the flute again. Terrified that he was dealing with no ordinary human being, and as if possessed by a demon or a god, Hakamadara followed the man, completely mystified. Eventually, the man walked into a gate behind which was a large house. He stepped inside from the veranda after removing his shoes. While Hakamadara was thinking he must be the master of the house, the man came back and summoned him. As he gave him a robe made of thick cotton cloth, he said, "If you need something like this in the future, just come and tell me. If you jump on somebody who doesn't know your intentions, you may get hurt." Afterward, it occurred to Hakamadara that the house belonged to Governor of Setsu Fujiwara no Yasumasa. Later, when he was arrested, he is known to have observed he was such an unusually weird, terrifying man. Yasumasa was not a warrior by family tradition, because he was a son of Munetada. Yet he was not the least inferior to anyone who was a warrior by family tradition. He had a strong mind, was quick with his hands, and had tremendous strength. He was also subtle in thinking and plotting. So even the imperial court did not feel insecure in employing him in the way of the warrior. As a result, the whole world greatly feared him and was intimidated by him. By Napoleon Bonaparte. The first quality of a general-in-chief is to have a cool head which receives exact impressions of things, which never gets heated, which never allows itself to be dazzled or intoxicated by good or bad news. The successive, simultaneous sensations which he receives in the course of a day must be classified and must occupy the correct places they merit to fill, because common sense and reason are the results of the comparison of a number of sensations, each equally well considered. There are certain men who, on account of their moral and physical constitution, paint mental pictures out of everything. However exalted be their reason, their will, their courage, and whatever good qualities they may possess, nature has not fitted them to command armies, nor to direct great operations of war. From Aesop's Fables. There was a fox who had never seen a lion, but one day he happened to meet one of these beasts face to face. On this first occasion he was so terrified that he felt he would die of fear. He encountered him again, and this time he was also frightened, but not so much as the first time. But on the third occasion when he saw him, he actually plucked up the courage to approach him and began to chat. This fable shows that familiarity soothes our fears. From Hagakure, the Book of the Samurai, by Yamamoto Tsunetomo. In the words of the ancients, one should make his decisions within the space of 7 breaths. Lord Takanobu said, "If discrimination is long, it will spoil." Lord Naoshige said, "When matters are done leisurely, 7 out of 10 will turn out badly." A warrior is a person who does things quickly. When your mind is going hither and thither, discrimination will never be brought to a conclusion. With an intense, fresh, and underlaying spirit, one will make his judgments within the space of 7 breaths. It is a matter of being determined and having the spirit to break right through to the other side. From Cicero, The Life and Times of Rome's Greatest Politician, by Anthony Everett. On a famous occasion during the Civil War, Caesar tripped when disembarking from a ship on the shores of Africa and fell flat on his face. With his talent for improvisation, he spread out his arms and embraced the earth as a symbol of conquest. By quick thinking, he turned a terrible omen of failure into one of victory. From On War, by Karl von Clausewitz. We mean the ability to keep one's head at times of exceptional stress and violent emotion, but it might be closer to the truth to assume that the faculty known as self-control, the gift of keeping calm even under the greatest stress, is rooted in temperament. It is itself an emotion which serves to balance the passionate feelings and strong characters without destroying them, and it is this balance alone that assures the dominance of the intellect. The counterweight, we mean, is simply the sense of human dignity, the noblest pride and deepest need of all, the urge to act rationally at all times. Therefore, we would argue that a strong character is one that will not be unbalanced by the most powerful emotions. From The Red Badge of Courage, by Stephen Crane. However, he perceived now that it did not greatly matter what kind of soldiers he was going to fight, so long as they fought, which fact no one disputed. There was a more serious problem. He lay in his bunk pondering upon it. He tried to mathematically prove to himself that he would not run from a battle. A little panic fear grew in his mind. As his imagination went forward to a fight, he saw hideous possibilities. He contemplated the lurking menaces of the future, and failed in an effort to see himself standing stoutly in the midst of them. He recalled his visions of broken-bladed glory, but in the shadow of the impending tumult, he suspected them to be impossible pictures. He sprang from the bunk and began to pace nervously to and fro. "Good Lord, what's the matter with me?" he said aloud. He felt that in this crisis, his laws of life were useless. Whatever he had learned of himself was here of no avail. He was an unknown quantity. He saw that he would again be obliged to experiment as he had in early youth. He must accumulate information of himself, and meanwhile he resolved to remain close upon his guard, lest those qualities of which he knew nothing should everlastingly disgrace him. "Good Lord," he repeated in dismay. For days he made ceaseless calculations, but they were all wondrously unsatisfactory. He found that he could establish nothing. He finally concluded that the only way to prove himself was to go into the blaze, and then, figuratively, to watch his legs to discover their merits and faults. He reluctantly admitted that he could not sit still and with a mental slate and pencil derive an answer. To gain it, he must have blaze, blood, and danger, even as a chemist requires this, that, and the other. So he fretted for an opportunity. And lastly, from Hara, the Vital Center, by Carl Graf von Durkheim. The man with center has calm, unprejudiced judgment. He knows what is important, what unimportant. He meets reality serenely and with detachment, keeping his sense of proportion. The Hara no Aruhito, man with center, faces life calmly, is tranquil, ready for anything. Nothing upsets him. If suddenly fire breaks out and people begin to shout in wild confusion, he does the right thing immediately and quietly. He ascertains the direction of the wind, rescues what is most important, fetches water, and behaves unhesitatingly in the way the emergency demands. The hara no naihito is the opposite of all this. The hara no naihito applies to the man without calm judgment. He lacks the measure which should be second nature. Therefore he reacts haphazardly and subjectively, arbitrarily and capriciously. He cannot distinguish between important and unimportant, essential and unessential. His judgment is not based upon facts, but on temporary conditions, and rests on subjective foundations, such as moods, whims, nerves,